Richard Alley, Evan Pugh Professor of Geosciences and author of Earth, the Operator's Manual. Great book and a great PBS series. Next is Dave Titley, retired U.S. Navy Rear Admiral, Professor of Practice in our Department of Meteorology and Atmospheric Sciences, and founding director of the Center for Solutions to Weather and Climate Risk. And off to my right is Tom Richard, Professor of Agricultural and Biological Engineering and Director of Penn State Institutes of Energy and Environment. And we have Klaus Keller, Professor of Geosciences and Director of Penn State's Center for Climate Risk Management. And then, last but not least, Erica Smithwick, Associate Professor of Geography and Director of Penn State's Center for Landscape Dynamics. So, I think what we'll do is start. Oh, is this not?
Yeah, this one's on.
Yeah. Better. Okay, great. All right, so we're going to then get going with the panel discussion. I am going to start off with asking each member of the panel a question that has to do both with the content of the film and their own expertise. And then we will open it up to the audience for a question and answer. And I guess we'll go about 30 minutes or so with the whole thing, 30, 40 minutes. So let me start with Richard. So there is a fair amount of discussion in the movie about the, oh, I forgot to say who I am, didn't I? Okay. So I am Professor Michael Mann. I have joint appointments in the departments of Meteorology and Atmospheric Science and the Department of Geosciences. I direct the Penn State Earth Systems Science Center, and I'm the co-author of a new book with the Washington Post editorial cartoonist Tom Tolles entitled The Madhouse Effect, about climate change and climate change denial. So we're going to start out with Richard. Question about ice sheets and sea level rise. There's some discussion of that in the movie, and in fact we had a seminar today where we actually had a presentation by Dave Pollard, who is an ice sheet expert here at Penn State, talking about the likely expected loss of ice from the ice sheets and possible sea level rise in the future. And there's still some uncertainty about just how much sea level rise we've committed to. In the movie, there was a statement at one point that we've probably already committed to 4 to 6 meters of sea level rise just from the warming that's already taken place. And so I was hoping, Richard, you could speak to what the current state of play is in that area of science, what the uncertainties are, what the implications are.
So thank you. So first, you good people in the back, if you're happy standing up, that's great. If you want a seat, there's some down front and some on the sides, and we'll find you seats, so that's great. Sea level rise, large uncertainties. Probably we have not yet committed to the worst, and we're fairly close to doing it. People are planning for 3 feet by late in this century. It could be 2, it could be 4, it could be 20. And that sort of distribution, if we don't change our ways, if we continue to ramp up warming, that we're planning for something, it could be a little better, a little worse, or a lot worse, keeps coming up over and over and over again. And ultimately, it probably comes down to the fact that it's much easier to break things than it is to build them, and simply cranking up CO2 will not turn the planet into the Garden of Eden, because that takes getting a lot of things right, but it might break things. And so when you look at uncertainties, the louder someone says you're not certain, the more worried they probably should be, because the distribution is a long tail of bad things where stuff we care about breaks.
Thanks, Richard. And that actually leads naturally to a question I had for Klaus, which is about climate risk and the distribution of risk and the implications of uncertainty and how that plays into climate risk management, which is a topic you study and you direct a center related to that topic as well.
Thank you, Mike. Good point. And I think the issue about risk is something maybe a little bit deeper in addition to the perspective we had so far. Number one is to recognize that once by the act of emitting CO2, we trigger new risks. And one of the key things is we move into a place that from a historic point of view, we've never been before. So there was the issue about tipping points, and one way to bring about this is, if this is on this table, this is the known place. By going towards the edge of the table, we expose ourselves more to risks. And so the issue about emitting CO2 triggers new risks, that's number one. And I think the point that it's easier to break things than to be just lucky, I think it's clearly there. There's an asymmetry, and it's sometimes the tails of the distribution that hurt you. There's another point in terms of risk management, which I'd like to comment here. The movie is great and has many good ideas, but it is to some extent focuses on one important thing, mitigation, how we have a carbon tax, how we reduce CO2 emissions. It's important to recognize, and this has been raised before, much of the warming has been baked in already. We have a much higher CO2 concentration, and basically the climate change for the next 30, 40, 50 years is pretty independent already of what we've done. Think about like a big tanker that has a big inertia, and there's a canoe in front, and you can say, oh, I want to stop, I want to go back. Just the inertia drives you over things you don't want to go over. That's number one. So the issue there is, sometimes you also want to brace for impact and make disasters duller. But that brings us to the issue of adapting to climate change, which is sometimes, it's an A word, it's something we don't want to talk about because it takes away from mitigation. But it's important because there's one discussion about there's something will happen to us and how to adapt. Just from a different perspective, one of the most famous checklists in flying is when you're a single plane, the engine goes off. The first thing is, what's your airspeed? The next one, big bullet, fly the plane, before you actually start getting into restarting the engine. And I think the fly the plane, don't fly the stuff that actually is already committed is an important point that, to some extent, I think could be expanded in a movie like that. Thank you.
Thanks, Klaus. And indeed, that's an important point. As our the current director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy under Barack Obama is John Holdren, who actually has expertise in the area of climate science and environmental science. And as he has put it, basically the solution is going to consist of three possible approaches, three possible modes of responding to the threat. There is mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. And it's up to us to decide how much of each we can tolerate. I want to continue with the subject of impacts and move on to national security, because the movie actually weighs into this matter, the national security dimensions of climate change several times. There's a discussion of the military implications of an open Arctic Ocean. There is a discussion of water wars, when we have decreasing water resources in mid-latitude regions, large parts of North America, Eurasia. That likely leads to conflict and instability. And then ultimately, sea level rise. As low-lying island nations disappear, as coastal regions disappear, then you've got a growing global population competing for less land, less food, less water. That's a prescription for a national security and conflict catastrophe. So I'd like our own resident expert on all of that, Dave Titley, to weigh in.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Yeah, it was an interesting movie. I don't know if anybody noticed at minute 9 the irony alert. So you have this film here, then took the clips of Fox News, and they showed, Sean Hannity and all those guys. So you know who owns National Geographic? That's James Murdoch. And Rupert Murdoch, his dad, owns Fox. So it's going to be an interesting Thanksgiving around that table there, because, yeah, and I've had dinner with James, and it's you get into this, what can we do? And it's like, well, you might want to have a conversation with your dad. That could help. Anyways, but that's not what we were asked to talk about. But that was the first irony of it. The other one was Sean Hannity asking for science. I thought that was actually maybe the funniest funniest quip in the whole thing. Yeah, for the military, you know, I talk about this in terms of two arcs. It's a readiness issue and it's a risk issue. Pretty much, if you have military force, you want to make sure that you're ready to do whatever the President and the Secretary of Defense tells you to do. So if you're part of the Department of Defense or a senior defense official, you need to think through multiple future scenarios. You think of changes in demographics, economics, political conditions. And when I started the Navy's Task Force on Climate Change, he said, well, why wouldn't you think of changes, you know, we call it in military jargon, the physical battle space. Most people here would call it the environment. But if that's changing, don't you want to know about that? Because the American way of war is we want to fight the away game, but we want to do it with a home field advantage. I mean, we don't want to fight here. We send our forces overseas, wherever. So you better know what's going on. So from just a very simple apolitical view, it's a readiness issue. And then it's already being mentioned by both Richard and Klaus, there's some risk involved. And again, if you're in the Department of Defense, as a boss of mine told me, you know, we are not paid to think happy thoughts. So you want to think of what that fat tail is. You want to think of those maybe not very likely, but pretty significant events. And what would you do? How do you hedge? What kind of forces, what kind of structures do you put in place? So the Arctic is, as you know, we saw lots of polar bears in there, and you know, but there's going to be increased human activity. That's the part that the security forces care about. These geostrategic threats, Syria was mentioned. It's a pretty complicated story, but basically climate is one of the links in a very complex cause, but it is certainly one of the links in there. And then the way we get our forces ready in America is we use bases. And I told people for the Navy, you know, we kind of put our bases at sea level. It's a ship thing. You know, we're not the Air Force. We don't move to Minot, North Dakota. Although once I had the business manager for Minot, North Dakota in the audience, he said he'd welcome us. But so the Navy, but it's not just the Navy. All the services are going to deal with this, and it's more than sea level rise. It's things like temperature, it's fires, it's drought. The neighbors get unhappy when you set the training range alight because of you're using live fire ammunition. So all of those things feed in. So we have both the direct effects, and then we have the effects that we're going to have to deal with when we go downrange. And then finally, we will probably have additional conflicts, in part, not solely, but in part, exacerbated or even caused by climate change.
Thanks, Dave. We're going to try to transition now from the impacts and the risks to the solutions. And I'm going to ask Erica to comment on both, because Erica is our expert here on the panel when it comes to forest ecosystems and the role that they play in sequestering carbon. But as Dave just alluded to, we also have climate change impacts that involve forests. We saw in Alberta a record wildfire, the Fort McMurray wildfire this last spring and summer. And climate change has been implicated. It set the stage in terms of the considerable heat, the warm winter, the very dry conditions all came together to give us this unprecedented, the most, I believe, expensive fire in Canada's history. So forests are part of the problem, but they're also potentially part of the solutions. And I was hoping you could speak to both aspects.
Good, thanks. So first, when we think about wildfire, I think it's important to think about fire as you might understand it. So a campfire, you know what you need to light a campfire, you need fuel, you need an ignition source, and you need it to be dry, right? So fuels, ignition, and weather, let's say. And the thing is that we're manipulating all three of those levers, nationally and globally. We manipulate fuels by fire suppression, so then we have more fuels ready to burn. We're manipulating ignitions because there's more people living in those landscapes, and human-caused fires are increasing. And then we also are changing the weather, so we're having longer droughts. So the same snow that's going away from our glaciers is also leaving the mountaintops of the Rocky Mountains. And that means less snow melt, it means drier springs and drier summers, longer dry seasons. And so when all of those combine, you have a chance for high wildfire risk. And that has been happening again and again and again, and the Alberta story is one example of that, but it's happening all over. We spent $2 billion, well in 2015 we spent $2 billion on wildfire suppression activities. I bet it'll be greater this year. Half of that money goes to California, although the largest fires are indeed in Alaska, in places that don't normally burn, in the tundra, which releases a large amount of stored carbon that is normally stored in the permafrost. Okay, so it's thousands of years of carbon accrual that's going up after one fire. So that's what we get concerned about when we think about wildfire risk. I study work in Yellowstone National Park. Our science suggests that wildfires that used to occur for the past 10,000 years, used to have a risk of a severe fire every 100 to 300 years, quite normally for that ecosystem. We're now projecting that if you believe the relationship between climate and fire is in the past, and you carry that forward under climate change scenarios, you're now having wildfire risk of every 15 to 30 years. So the question really is, can the ecosystem recover? And unfortunately, a lot of the recovery adaptations that those trees have, like the ability to resprout, are also going away from climate change. So if you have a big wildfire, it's okay, the carbon can come back as long as the conditions are right for those species to come back. But unfortunately, if you have a drought right after the wildfire, then they're not going to come back. And so what we worry about, the tipping points in the ecosystem perspective, is when the forest doesn't come back as a forest. It comes back as a shrubland or a grassland system. And we're seeing massive conversions of forest land to shrublands in many parts of the western U.S. right now, largely driven by wildfire. Solution? In terms of the wildfire aspect of it, I'm going to go back to what Klaus said in terms of mitigation and adaptation. So mitigation is important in a lot of areas that were historically low severity fire systems in the southwestern United States. Going in there and doing mechanical thinning is appropriate for those systems. It may not be appropriate for other systems that historically have had more standard placing fire regimes. So in those areas, mitigation and fire risk may not be the best option, and really we're forced to adapt to being in a fire-prone system. In the western U.S., that means historically adapting a fire-wise community perspective. It means different methods of zoning, so that we're not moving into these fire-prone areas. And that requires cooperation at multiple levels of governance as well to create those kind of zoning laws. It may involve maps of fire risk so that people can make those informed decisions, which don't yet exist for the United States in any sort of good way. And we also have to start thinking about creative things like assisted migration and other ways to create and restore ecosystems that we might want to preserve to maintain that carbon balance and that carbon.
And last but not least, Tom, we heard a fair amount of discussion of solar and also wind as solutions, as ways of meeting our demand for energy and power in a carbon-friendly way. But of course, you and the institute that you head up does research into biofuels as well. And I was wondering if you could comment on the role that biofuels might play in the solution to the problem.
Sure, and first of all, I want to preface my comments by saying that I do work personally on biofuels, but there are phenomenal researchers at this university in solar, in wind, in energy storage, and several of them are in this room. And I don't want to discount that at all. In fact, living in Pennsylvania, we are actually allowed to buy our electricity from a variety of generators. And I buy mine from one that's 100% renewables, and it's solar, wind, and biomass, actually. This is a little bit of a depressing evening, right? So I want to add a note of hope, okay? The disadvantage of solar and wind is that they are only zero carbon emitting energy sources. And while we need them massively right now, projections are that we actually will go past tolerable limits if we stop. That's part of the comments earlier. The really cool thing about biomass energy is it actually allows negative carbon energy. And those of you who know your Earth system science know that this planet had an atmosphere full of CO2, that our fossil fuels from that atmosphere were transported through the process of photosynthesis, a 3 billion-year-old technology that works really, really well. And by the way, we have tremendous experts in that field at this university as well, and some of them are in this room. So the trick then is to take the power of photosynthesis and actually turn it into things that are useful. And some of those are growing forests and natural ecosystems, and using not just the above ground parts of the plants, but also the below ground roots to store carbon in the soil. And so those are tremendous. There's lots of work going on in that space. Biofuels and bioenergy can get you close to zero. The only way they can actually go negative is by sequestering carbon under the ground, which is actually a topic that environmentalists have been against for decades, because it was viewed as a way to allow coal and other fossil energy to continue, right? And I don't disagree with that, but it is a way to both mitigate fossil energy, but also allow biomass to move into a negative carbon space that I think we're as a society going to need. So that's an interesting thing to sort of pay attention to. But the final one I want to mention is that photosynthesis can also make a lot of other extraordinary things, including materials, bioplastics, biochemicals, buildings, including 10, 15, 18-story buildings that are going up right now where wood is being used as the structural material with new engineered processes. And when those substitute for concrete and steel, which are very energy-intensive and carbon-intensive materials, they make tremendous offsets. And they put that carbon in a place where it's going to be fixed for hopefully over 100 years. And that's going to help buy us time in other important ways. So I think there's a whole range of areas there. And I'd say, although the focus in the film was on some of the negative aspects of our managed ecosystems in terms of food, and it is phenomenal that 90% of our food system produces less than 10% of our calories. But we can also manage ecosystems to do really powerful things. We know a little bit about how to do that. We need to learn more. We need to start doing it in a very good way.
Thanks, Tom. And I'm a big fan of Elon Musk's, and I thought that it was nice that there was that segment that does look at the reasons for optimism, that we can tackle this problem. And so it's not all doom and gloom. There's a little bit of optimism in there. And interestingly enough, when Fisher Stevens talked to me about my role in the film, basically the problem they had was that Leo is extremely depressed and pessimistic about our prospects for actually doing something about the problem. And so he used the movie almost as a vehicle to try to turn Leo around and expose him to the reasons that do exist for, again, cautious optimism. One of the points that's emphasized in the movie towards the end, and indeed we are less than a week from an election. It's not coincidental that the film was shown shortly before this next presidential election. It is something that people should think about when they go to the voting booth. Voting on the issue of climate, and not just at the top of the ticket, but all the way down. So that's the only political statement that I'm going to make. Now we're going to open this up for Q&A with the audience, and maybe go 15, 20 minutes if people want to stick around. We'll see how much interest there is. Please, back here.
Hey, so I'm with Next Gen Climate. I wanted to ask a question about how we can organize politically to mitigate climate change.
We're going to get Klaus some exercise here.
I'm with Next Gen Climate here in State College. I wanted to ask a question about how we can organize politically to mitigate climate change.
Who wants to tackle that one?
I would say, okay, so full disclosure, I'm on a couple advisory boards, including something called Citizens Climate Lobby. They talk about a revenue-neutral carbon tax, and they probably are, no doubt. And when you're organizing these groups, think of who your target is. The left of center folks, the Democrats basically, I mean, they've drunk the Kool-Aid, okay? So, a lot of things, if we show more polar bears and stuff like that, you're preaching to the choir. the folks you need to really bring in somehow are the folks in the center and even center right, because under our system of government, this administration has not been able to pass a single piece of legislation. Why? Because it has to go through a Congress. And even when they had Democratic majorities in both houses, they were not able to do that. And that's another discussion for another day, why this administration was not able to do that. But I would say look at framing your issue, whether it's in terms of health, whether it's in terms of food, but think about it in terms that are going to attract the people who may be in that kind of undecided, haven't thought about it, center, even center right, and get them to basically advocate to their elected leaders at all levels. And when I give my talks, I say the question you should ask is, what are you going to do to stabilize the climate? This is sort of like dating 101. You do not ask a yes or no question. Are you in favor of carbon tax? That's yes, no. But you might get an interesting answer. And two, even if you don't, you at least register in that reptilian politician brain that they're interested. And it was brought up in the movie. It's something I always say. It's like Congress will not lead, but they can be led. And they will be led by you. They will be led by the voters. But if the voters keep putting this at number 21 of 20, they're not going to pay attention. And then you got to listen to Mike and all the evil people who work in this space here. So I'll just stop there. Richard?
Just to add a tiny bit more, they had that Harvard economist, and he showed the tax swap. The Congressional Budget Office looked at that, and they said, if global warming is an evil lie, everything you saw there about damages is an evil lie, that tax swap will have no serious impact on the economy, and it might help it. And because global warming is not an evil lie, that tax swap gives you a bigger economy with more jobs.
So here's something, so if you're looking at Washington State, anybody aware that Washington State actually has a carbon tax? You know who's opposing it? The environmental groups. Okay, so if you're on the left, you got to ask what's your big environmental groups like your Sierra clubs and stuff, why they're opposing it. Because that's not going to be helpful, because Richard just kind of said, these things will actually help us out a lot.
Okay, thanks. Let's take another question over here. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Willie Planson from Penn State, and I saw serious flaws in science. I saw serious flaws in science communications in the movie. 2 examples. How many of you are not eating beef tomorrow, or buying something that has palm oil? Well, let me tell you, palm oil is 4 times as efficient in producing oil as any other crop. So you could use 1 hectare of oil palm to produce as much oil as 4 hectares of anything else. So the problem is Indonesia, the corrupt government is a different issue. Palm oil is not a bad thing. The second is beef. Not all beef is bad. Beef can help sequester carbon in the soil. Not beef, but the system, the beef production system can help. There is a great example in South Africa with Alan Savory. So those presented just broader spectrum of bad things for beef and oil palm. And that is shooting ourselves in the foot, because those are very good ideas.
Question for the panel?
How can science communication be improved so this is not what everybody sees? Because there is a backlash against the cattle ranchers, the oil palm producers, for example, in South America, where there are systems that work.
So I've got one quick thought, and then Tom, I think, has some thoughts here as well. So I actually have done quite a bit of cleanup with respect to a previous film that Leo was also involved on. Some of you may have heard or seen the film Cowspiracy, and it actually communicated quite a bit of misinformation when it has to do with the role that agriculture and farming plays in the climate change problem. It's not trivial, it's not negligible, but the movie creates this sort of notion that it's the main contributor to the problem, when in fact it's not. The main contributor is the burning of fossil fuels. So I do think it's important for us to call out misinformation, regardless of what side of the debate it may fall out on. I think that's our role as scientists, is to be objective arbiters and referees when it comes to the public discourse over this issue.
Yeah, I'll second that, and I should sort of mention, I come from 5 generations of cattle ranchers out of Colorado, so for me to say negative things about beef or lamb causes a number of people to roll over their graves, literally. But every agricultural system can be managed well or poorly, right? And one of the challenges is these are complex questions, and yes, you can give examples that are going to be contrary to maybe some of the things in the film, but there is a problem with rainforest destruction. It's a complicated problem, and people want to have simple solutions. There is a problem with our livestock system here and our food system. In this country, roughly, I think the quote was 10% or 12% of our emissions are from agriculture. And most of those are from bovine, but it's not just beef, actually. Half of it's the dairy system, right? So if you switch from being a carnivore to a vegetarian and you eat a lot of yogurt and cheese and milk, that's the same species, actually. So I think the important thing is to try to sort of be thoughtful about it and to know as much about the systems as you can, and use the critical thinking that you hopefully are learning at a university to distinguish the right from the wrong.
Great. Thanks, Tom.
Just very quickly, in a broader sense on this, when you're asking for this, it kind of follows onto the previous answer. I think we just have to be careful in demonizing either industries, companies, and it's a balance, because there are some that have demonstrable bad behavior, intentional bad behavior, and they probably should be called out. But the movie kind of had a pretty broad brush on some things, and I think that sometimes can get almost a counter-revolution kind of action. So just in general, if we stick to the facts and look at what are the solutions, as some of which are being already talked about, I think that's kind of a way forward. That's just my personal opinion.
Thanks, David. We have a question right here. We'll get you next. We've got one over here. We've got one over here. So stay tuned, please.
First, I want to say I really like this movie, but there might be a mistake in the movie. The Chinese types, I think the demonstration occurred in that part. They protest the chemical brands. They don't. It's about, maybe it's about the environment, but it's not about climate change. So my question is, there is a nuclear power built in my hometown. It just happened suddenly. So we don't have the conversation like just any Chinese government, local government is just build it. So I was thinking nuclear power is a good solution to help to address this issue. Thank you.
Thanks. I think what they, in the movie, the connection they're drawing is that the burning of coal is what has produced a lot of those microparticles that are causing health issues. And so they are related in the sense that if you're getting your energy from dirty coal burning, then there is also a potential health impact. And China has been suffering that in their large cities. And so in some ways it has drawn attention to the issue of should we be continuing to burn coal for energy. And the interesting thing is that China, in that bilateral agreement that was mentioned between the U.S. and China to reduce carbon emissions, China is actually ahead of their commitment. Not only are they not building new coal-fired power plants as fast as they were, they're actually decommissioning coal-fired power plants and spending a whole lot more on solar and wind energy than we are here in the U.S. Now, you raise another interesting question, though. Can nuclear energy play a role in weaning us from carbon-based energy? It's not renewable in the conventional sense, but it also doesn't involve the emission of carbon into the atmosphere. So can nuclear energy be part of the solution? I'm not going to answer that question. If anyone else wants to tackle it.
I would try. In my experience, talking to lots of groups in lots of places, the nuclear question is the one that is most likely to generate a really heated discussion among people who are serious about finding solutions. No pun intended, yes. So people who actually accept that climate change is real, accept that we need to find solutions to it, you bring up nuclear and we will have a fight, virtually guaranteed. And so what that says to me is that while nuclear absolutely unequivocally works, we can do it, we have not yet generated that consensus in the United States that would allow it to move forward directly and rapidly. My brother works for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. He is a retired Coast Guard officer who now works for the NRC. If you love nuclear, you better love the central government, because the government carries the long-term and catastrophic insurance for the nuclear industry, which means that you want my brother to be watching over them because you're paying for them if it breaks. But there seems to be some overlap between people who hate the government and love nuclear, and that doesn't work.
Come to Chicago on Tuesday. I'm part of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, and we are going to do a whole day on the role of nuclear power in a non-carbon-based energy system.
Okay, but don't emit any carbon on your way to Chicago.
Well, I didn't cancel the flight, so I guess that's it.
Another quick comment, I think it was a very good question. There's often a tendency to look for a single solution, or a magic bullet, or a silver bullet. Now, the magic bullet comes from an opera, and this didn't really work out in the opera. And the point is that this is a problem which, by most estimates, doesn't have a single solution. It's a portfolio. It's mitigation and adaptation. And it's not just nuclear. It's not just solar. It's horses for courses, use the right tool for the right job in a portfolio approach. This, I'm sorry to say, this makes it a little bit more complicated to do. It's not a simple message of hope, but it's maybe a more realistic message of hope. So it's a complex problem, but on the other hand, we as a society have solved somewhat similar complex problem before, so there is also hope.
Maybe 2 or 3 more questions, and I did promise Gina.
Okay, I'm a geographer, but I used to study international relations as an undergrad major. So I was like, when I was looking at the documentary, Leo was frustrated that this Paris agreement didn't have a binding power over the countries that participated, but that is that made me think that, and he was suggesting carbon tax for that binds every nation state in the world. But it's when I studied world history of international relations, there has never been a time in history that there was a real law that binds every state, and it's so that's why Kyoto Protocol failed, and the United States failed out, and so what is the suggestion for carbon tax, other than just grassroots movements Washington State that was enabled by the people, a political inclination to support that.
Thanks.
It's a good question. Maybe one analogy which is helpful is that there have been cases when the world came together to have binding agreements. For example, one is chlorofluorocarbons. When there was discovery that emitting chlorofluorocarbons damaged the ozone layer and caused damage, at the end the world came together, and we actually are now on a downward slide of the chlorofluorocarbons concentrations, and the ozone is recovering. So there are examples that work, number one. Number two, there are examples where the world has come together for certain things which are unacceptable. torture is one. It's not eradicated, but it's clearly there. And then, but more, we're close to home here. There are very smart people who think about carbon taxes and have stable coalition that then get it all, or most of it. You don't need all, but need most of it. And so one approach, for example, Bill Nordhaus in Yale thinks about an agreement where you start with one and then add one, and then when you have trade, you actually require them for be able to trade, to also have a charge on your carbon tax. And then you basically set this up as a way to be able to trade. You have to basically do your duties. There are many ways how different nations come together for many motives that then enforce rules. Is it perfect? No. Does it help? Often.
Thanks, Alex. One thing I would add, by the way, is when it comes to acid rain or ozone depletion, we saw a policy action under Republican administrations. Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, George H.W. Bush, their EPA, their EPAs all acted to solve global environmental problems. And the Montreal Protocol happened under Reagan's watch. Nixon created the EPA, and the Clean Air Act occurred over a course of administrations, but there was substantial progress during the administration of George H.W. Bush. So using market mechanisms to solve global environmental problems has not always been a partisan political issue. It's only relatively recent that that's happened, and it's worth keeping in mind. Another question here?
Yeah, so with a growing middle class in India and with the American consumption and Chinese industrialization, I'm just wondering, is it possible to further our technological innovation and development while also preserving and conserving our natural resources? Is there such thing as a balance?
So I wrote a book on this topic in 2009, and when I wrote the book, I could not, with a straight face, say that solar power was competitive with anything for anything except my solar calculator, which was really good. There was absolutely no question that solar cost a fortune. And 7 years later, every utility in America is either embracing solar, trying to kill solar, or both. But they're all trying to figure out what to do with solar, because solar has dropped in price so fantastically and so rapidly that it is now part of the discussion. We can learn, we can build, we can teach. If you were to, suppose that you tried to make this movie 10,000 years ago. Think about it for a minute. Native persons had come into North America and it had been full of mammoths and mastodons, and it was steak on the hoof, and they had killed them off. And they were spreading, eventually we spread across South Sea Islands and we killed off all kinds of things. And whenever a drought hit, people died because they couldn't feed their kids. The world was overpopulated with a few million people. And then we learned. And we built, and we taught, and we grew. And we went from a world that was overpopulated with a few million people to a world that may or may not be overpopulated with a few billion people. But we doubled the population tenfold, 10 times. And so we can screw this up in ways that are just fantastically disastrous. But we can also solve it. And there's this long history of us burning anything we can get to get energy, running out of what we were burning, having panic, and trying to figure out what to do next. Pennsylvania was treeless. 100 years ago, Rothrock wrote, the first forester of the Commonwealth, wrote about the Great Pennsylvania Desert, because there were no trees left in Pennsylvania, there was no wildlife left in Pennsylvania, we had nothing to burn. And then we sort of figured out fossil fuels. And then we let trees grow back. And we're the first generation that knows how to fix this. And so we actually can do better than anybody else. Or we can screw it up.
So I think part of your question was about the great inequity in the world right now with respect to energy and material goods. And I think there's a lot of hope that we can now see pathways to having great economies without as much carbon emission as we've had before. But I do want to emphasize that those are not low energy strategies. That there's a really strong correlation between energy availability and access and many human development indices, health, education, and life expectancy. So we do not want to ask the 5 billion people that don't have enough energy not to get it. We need to make sure that they have an opportunity to have energy, but it needs to be clean energy. And we can do both.
I thought the film did a great job in actually making that point.
I actually thought the film kind of leaned towards the we all have to go live in a cave and wear a hair shirt and be a miter. I mean, they talk about cutting down and reducing and all that. I think you're right in what Richard and Tom have talked about there is how do we use the technologies that will be probably developed in the West, although they may be manufactured elsewhere. But does this become part of the great bargain in that we've screwed this up? The West has basically screwed this up. So what, at least moral, obligation do we have to make sure this technology comes in at affordable prices? I mean, I thought the most compelling character in the entire movie was the lady with the NGO from India. I mean, she was like, she was going to tell you the truth, and no matter how much DiCaprio squirmed, she was going to tell you the truth. So how do we help those 1.2 billion people, 300 million with no power? I mean, we can't just stand here and say use solar. How are we going to get it to them? But it's to Richard's point that we do have the technology, and I think it's our obligation to figure that out and to help them, not just have an abstract way, but that's going to be, frankly, your generation's grand challenge.
What I meant that the movie did a good job in making the point that Tom made was that it emphasized the fact that in areas in the developing world where there isn't already the energy infrastructure that exists here, where there isn't an electrical grid, distributed energy is going to make a lot more sense. We're going to leapfrog into a distributed energy system that could be substantially powered by renewable energy, by solar and other. So I thought that was an important point. I think we have time for maybe one last question. Yes.
Actually, I have 2 questions.
Let's keep it to one.
I have 2 questions. Okay.
Large question.
That's well, I'll just choose the one I want answered most. What about the problems with e-waste? Like, I know that America, we dump a lot of our e-waste off seas. So how do we combat? I know that emits a lot of carbon, and we have a lot of old technology. So how can we do that without
Tom may want to do that. Brilliant recycling. Tom, do you want to? This is your.
So I was mentioning a minute ago that we have an opportunity to kind of change the way we handle the material world, and e-waste is actually incredibly valuable. That's part of why we ship it other places is they can extract the platinum and gold and other precious metals that are in there and utilize materials. Unfortunately, not always under very environmentally safe methods, which is part of why a lot of it goes overseas. So I think recycling that e-waste effectively is going to be part of it. The electronic technologies now are really so much smaller impact per unit of useful value than they did 20 years ago. The question is how much do we need, and can we get by with a reasonable amount? And I think that's a question of consumption, sustainable consumption that we have to face in every part of our lives.
All right. Well then, all right. One last question. Yeah.
I don't need it. I can see. I was thinking about exactly what you had mentioned about NEPA was passed under Nixon, and the whole concept of environment wasn't a partisan issue. And gotten to this point where it is, so how do we fix that?
Well, I will reiterate a point that I made earlier, which is the voting booth is one place to try to fix that. Voting and making your views on matters such as the priority that we should be giving to environmental sustainability and to clean energy. As long as the public is not expressing its will, and not as David made the point earlier, as long as we are not demanding that from our policymakers, we're not going to see it. And David is correct that unfortunately, issues like climate change still lie fairly far down on the list of priorities when pollsters ask the electorate what they're most concerned about. That means that obviously each of us voting individually isn't enough. We have to create a greater public awareness for the threats that are posed by climate change and for the opportunities that are presented by transitioning to clean energy, framing it, for example, as an issue of international competitiveness. We know China, the rest of the world is moving ahead towards a clean energy economy. If we choose not to do that, then we fall behind the rest of the world. So I do think that we need to find better ways to frame this issue, and that's sort of a point that's come up repeatedly in our discussion here tonight. Others?
I think I'm echoing what you said. I think that we need to do more telling and to say this is the way it is, and more listening. So why are you feeling that way? What are you needing? Because I think a lot of the solutions will get to their core issue. So if it's health or food or economy, if we're both having that conversation, we can have that together and save the environment. But if we keep saying this is happening, you've got to listen, it's going to put people off. And there's plenty of scientific evidence to show that people don't learn very well that way. They learn when they're in a collaborative environment, right? So how do we create those collaborative environments of learning where we can find mutual solutions?
Yeah, I'd certainly echo everything that both Mike and Erica said there. The framing is very important, so health, security. I mean, some of these other than environmental things will sometimes attract different people, so can you align the message, the messenger, and the audience? I'm a good person to talk about security. I'm probably not the right person to go talk to the NRDC. So those things have to align. It's beyond the scope of this panel, but honestly, and we'll see what happens in 6 days, but things like talk radio and the stuff that is put out on talk radio and basically unchallenged within their circle for decades, and frankly, it's far bigger than climate. There is this anti-science, anti-knowledge, self-talk. I'm not sure what else I can call it here, that needs to be challenged. And people can say it's a cycle, but it's a very destructive one. And it leads to things like we don't get vaccines, and we have almost medieval type fears of some technologies. If a science or like National Academy of Science says the sky is blue, you get people saying, no, the sky is something else. And so that has to be fixed. It's beyond the scope for here, but what we can do is make sure that, this is talked about. DiCaprio said nobody ever talks about this, and he's kind of right. We need to talk about this. Richard, you are?
Yeah, find the win-win. Don't demonize people. Almost everybody involved with this are good people. There are a few bad actors and who are doing this for a living, but almost everybody involved in this are good people. Fossil fuels have been fantastic for us. We asked for the energy and they gave it to us. And we have trees and we have whales because we burn fossil trees and fossil algae. And that's true. And so, don't demonize them and find the win-wins. Ultimately, if you are interested in the ethical issues, you want to move away from fossil fuels in a measured way. If you are interested in the environmental issues, you want to move away from fossil fuels in a measured way. If you're interested in the economic issues, you want to move away from fossil fuels in a measured way. Not in panic, not in demonizing them, but in taking the advantages that are out there that will help people. And so look for the win-wins and do it with a knowledge that we owe a lot of good to the people that we're going to move away from.
Just a few final thoughts about that. All great points from the members of the panel, all very useful and complementary perspectives. I do think that ultimately we do face a great challenge, and I would differ with Richard perhaps a little bit in the language. The transition that's required is probably more than measured. Some would characterize it as a revolution, not unlike the sort of galvanization that we saw during during World War II. The same sort of mobilization arguably is necessary if we are going to avert what many scientists would reasonably describe as catastrophic levels of climate change. Warming of more than 2 degrees Celsius. We're more than halfway there. If we continue on the course that we're on for another decade or so, we're probably committed to those levels of warming and climate change. So I do think that there have been a few bad actors that have poisoned the public discourse. Unfortunately, that was true with tobacco. It was true with acid rain and ozone depletion, and it's true with climate change today. There are some enlightened individuals and corporations within the fossil fuel industry, but there have also been some bad actors who have hid the information that they had about the potential threat of continued reliance on fossil fuels. And there's been some discussion about that recently, and some discussion about the need maybe to hold some of those bad actors accountable in the same way that the tobacco industry was held accountable. Ultimately, there's a good faith debate to be had about this problem and about the solutions, and we need conservatives and progressives both at the table in discussing those solutions. But we do need to recognize that there's a problem, and we probably have to call out those bad actors who continue to deny that there's a problem while taking money from fossil fuel interests to do so. I do think it's important to call that out. I know that there are actually a couple organizations that are set up outside the room here that actually are working on the policy solutions to climate change and trying to get people involved. And so I would encourage you to check them out on your way out. And please thank all the members of the panel.